For our Origins of Warfare project, we will be looking at both the Russian and Chinese Civil War and then comparing and contrasting them to one another. First, we will be going over the causes and effects of the Russian Civil War. There are many prevalent events that contributed to the beginning of the Russian Civil War, but two of the most prevalent are the Russian Revolution and the February Revolution. The Russian Revolution began in January of 1905 and lasted until June of 1907. The beginning of the revolution began when peaceful demonstrations in many of the most influential cities of Russia transformed into an event of mass bloodshed with Bloody Sunday. As a mass of 100,000 workers marched towards the Tsar's palace to meet him with their list of demands, they were shot upon by his troops. 130 people were killed and hundreds of others were gravely injured, as the event became the true catalyst for the Russian Revolution. After Bloody Sunday, the Tsar was faced by tremendous amounts of criticism and pushback from the citizens of his country, forcing him to announce his intention to establish an elected assembly of advisors to help add public opinion onto the government. However, the Tsar's proposal did not satisfy a public hungry for justice and a voice, and the protests continued. As strikes began to become more organized and unions formed, the Tsar was forced to acknowledge the acts of his people, establishing the October Manifesto of 1905, which promised the establishment of a constitution and elected legislature. While these changes did not meet the demands of the radicals in the country, the majority of workers and moderates were satisfied with the response and ceased many of their protests. Although the uprising itself failed to replace the Tsarist autocracy like its original intention, it saw the establishment of many reforms, including the Fundamental Laws Act of 1906, which led to the establishment of the State Duma, an elected body of legislature that lasted until the Russian Civil War. The February Revolution was more of a direct precedent to the revolution itself, lasting from February to March of 1917. The actions of Russia in World War I were greatly concerning to the Russian people, and they were taking a large toll on the livelihood of their country. Due to Russia's dependence on foreign trade, they were greatly impacted by the German takeover of Russia's eastern ports. The takeover shut down much of Russia's railways, electricity, and supply systems, resulting in food and job shortages. The Tsar attempted to boost morale by taking over the Russian army, but with disastrous losses under his belt, his actions did little in his favor, instead resulting in many Russians losing faith in the Tsar and the Tsarist system. The strikes that followed his actions led to his abdicating of the throne and the end of the Tsarist regime. The Russian Civil War had many effects within the country, most being more harmful to the general public. The Russian Civil War saw an overwhelming amount of casualties from both Russian forces and their allies, 300,000 killed in action, and another 450,000 from the rampant diseases that the country experienced both during and after the war. In terms of civilian casualties, disastrous droughts, famines, and pandemics affected the Russian population. 3 million people dying of typhus alone in 1920, and by 1922 there were an estimated 7 million child deaths due to the harsh conditions the war pushed upon Russia. The war also caused a huge economic shift that affected it even after its conclusion. In the duration of the war, Lenin established what he called war communism, which alludes to the idea of having a communist state during a war to protect the people and the economy of the said state. Despite the problems of economic safety, the war communism Lenin put in place had little to no effect on the maintaining of the economy during the war, and simply made sure that Soviets stayed in power while the economy came to a standstill. It was due to this standstill that Lenin put in place the new economic policy, or the NEP. The NEP retained most agriculture, retail trade, and small-scale industry to private owners and management, but kept the state in control of heavy industry, transport, baking, and foreign trade. The NEP also allowed money to be reintroduced into the economy in 1922 after its abolishment under war communism, and lower classes were allowed to cultivate their own land as long as they paid taxes to the state. The NEP allowed for the economy to become closer to its pre-war state, more stabilized, and an economy where business flourished so much, workers in the business were called NEP men. However, the NEP was viewed by the Soviet government as a temporary solution to their economic troubles, and the leaders of the Soviet government were divided about the application of the NEP. The NEP was later ended by Joseph Stalin in 1929 after a series of grain shortages prompted Stalin to eliminate the private ownership of farmland, allowing the state to repossess control over all industry and commerce by 1931. Now we will be going over the causes and effects of the Chinese Civil War.
The Chinese Civil War was a civil conflict between the nationalists and the Chinese Communist parties in China. It took place in two parts, between 1927 and 1937, then later continuing between 1945 and 1949. The time in between these two phases of fighting was during the Second Sino-Japanese War. During this war, Civil hostilities between the Nationalists and the Chinese Communist Party declined because both parties focused on uniting against Japan. As Japan mostly ended up taking over nationalist areas, this became an opportunity for the Chinese Communist Party to gain more strength. The CCP was able to gain strength by taking over countrysides in China, while the nationalists were busy, isolated, and preoccupied with the fight against the Japanese. As Japanese control continued to spread in China, the nationalist government was subjected to more conflict. Because of this, the U.S. intervened following its declaration of war against Japan. The Sino-Japanese War came to an end in August 1945 when the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan rapidly withdrew from China following their formal surrender, which ended up renewing the civil conflict between the Nationalists and Chinese Communist Party. When Japanese troops left, they were instructed to surrender to the nearest Chinese troops in the region. So the surrender became a chance for both the Nationalist and Chinese Communist parties to gain more power through territory and also through Japanese modern weaponry. Long-term causes of the war were placed in social inequalities in Chinese society. By 1937, China was predominantly rural. Peasants lived in basic living conditions with no running water or electricity or even a paved road. Poverty was so bad that most peasants didn't even have their own land, but rather rented it from landlords who charged high rents. This left peasants with very little money, barely enough to survive, while landlords got increasingly wealthier. The same polarization in wealth also occurred in the urban areas of China. Workers received low wages with no social security and had high rates of unemployment, so many were still forced to live in slum-like conditions on the outskirts of cities. The role of central authority, which had been conducted in China since 1644, collapsed with the death of the last emperor. Where'd it go? The role of central authority, which had been conducted in China since 1644, collapsed with the death of the last emperor on February 12, 1912. At that point, the ideals of the reformer Nationalist Party were not allowed to guide the republic, as General Yuan Shikai At that point, the ideals of the reformer Nationalist Party were not allowed to guide the republic, as General Yuan Shikai established himself as dictator. Once Shikai died, though, the real fragmentation of political power in China occurred through the rise of regional warlords. The Nationalist Party worked with the USSR in 1923 to help establish its power in China. Following the suggestions of the USSR, the Nationalists and Communists of China worked together starting in 1924 under the United Front Alliance. In 1926, the Chinese Communist Party and Nationalists launched a military campaign called the Northern Expedition. They aimed to defeat the warlords and reunify China. The Nationalist Party emerged as the ruling party in China, but surfacing differences between the Nationalists and Chinese Communist Party quickly led to the outbreak of conflict between them. The political ideology of the Nationalist Party was to create a modern, unified, independent China through the three principles of the people, which were nationalism, popular sovereignty, and the principle of the people's livelihood. The Chinese Communist Party had some similarities to the Nationalists, like being in favor of eradicating foreign concessions and building on the defeat of the warlords to help unify China. But the CCP also aimed to restructure society in accordance with Marxist principles, like elimination of property, ownership, and the privilege of the bourgeoisie class. The Chinese Civil War encompassed both socioeconomic and political effects. When examining socioeconomic effects and looking at casualties, the number of deaths caused by the Chinese Civil War varied a lot when including deaths from famine and destruction. One ranged for just the years between 1945 to 1949 is 4 to 6 million. This doesn't even include the other period of conflict from 1927 to 1937. With the Chinese Communist Party taking control in China, social structure changed, with landlords being removed from power and peasants being given their own land. It was also recognized that this method of redistribution of land contravened the principles of communism. But it was stated that once communists had secured power, then there would be a move towards creating cooperative farms and then collective farms. Impacts for women varied, all depending on social status, whether she resided in rural or urban areas or within communist or nationalist-controlled territory. But after the war and the CCP's victory, new laws were established to give greater legal rights to women, such as the Marriage Law Act of May 1, 1950. This law abolished arranged marriages, granted husband and wife the right to seek divorce on equal terms, guaranteed equality in the management and inheritance of family property, and stipulated that a husband could not apply for divorce if his wife was pregnant. There was also an increase in educational opportunities for women, with over 6,000 colleges and universities admitting women by 1935. Social customs and poverty frequently meant that often little change occurred in reality for the majority of Chinese women. The Civil War was devastating to the Chinese economy. Civil conflict destroyed significant areas of agricultural land and further weakened their industrial production that had already only been a tiny proportion of Chinese economy. Such a long conflict also greatly impacted currency, causing a rapidly rising rate of inflation. Obviously, with the taking over of the Chinese Communist Party, political rule in China turned to communism. Mao sought outright authority under communism, so Red Army troops were sent to establish control over even the most remote regions of China, which led to China being the most unified that it had been in decades. The Chinese Civil War also led to an increase in the intensity of the Cold War. From the perspective of the U.S., the Chinese Communist Party's victory was a sign of the further dangers of the global spread of communism, which led the USA to become more determined to resist its spread.
Now we'll compare and contrast the Russian Civil War to the Chinese Civil War. There are many similarities and differences in the causes of war of both the Russian and Chinese Civil Wars. On the side of the Russian Civil War, most of the causes of war had to do with the massacre of the people, or Bloody Sunday, uprising against the government, and instead of internal conflicts like the Chinese Civil War was prevalent with, it consisted of the people versus the government, rising up against the government, as well as contributing to things like peaceful protests. The German takeover also affected the country economically and socially. Because of World War I, they took over a lot of trading ports, and because of Russia's dependence on external trading, their jobs were lower and the amount of money that they made were lower. Before the Russian Civil War, there was also a lack of morale in the armies and militaries of the Tsar, who was the person in charge of the country at the time, which also contributed to the amount of soldiers who went with Vladimir Lenin instead of the Tsar. On the Chinese Civil War side, a lot of it had to do with the U.S. intervention in the Second Sino-Japanese War, because Japan had control of China at the time. The war affected China as well as Japan, and then it also had to do with Japanese surrendering and their rapid withdrawal from China, because it left China in kind of a state of economic, political, and social shock, because they didn't know what to do, and also they had been under the same control for a while. And then for similarities, both wars had a collapse of previous government structure, communist parties rising to power, internal conflict between groups, and economic strain, all of which contributed to tensions and war reasons within both countries.
In both the Russian Civil War and Chinese Civil War, there was a change in political system to communism. Both wars also experienced overwhelming casualties because of being civil wars and experienced disrupted agriculture. In the Chinese Civil War, when land was redistributed, peasants owned it. There was also an increase in the rights for women. For the Russian Civil War, there was a reduce in wages to combat the economic drop, and they also experienced disease, and drought, and extreme famine.